couple of years ago, when I approached Veronica about getting involved in this project, she was at the time the director for research of the Sol LeWitt catalogue raisonné. And I can't tell you what a total delight and pleasure it is to be able to introduce her today as our colleague now at the university, because she's recently been appointed the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Blanton Museum. So please welcome Veronica.
Thank you, Andre, for so generously inviting me to give this lecture, and thank you all for coming. I'm sort of amazed by how many faces I recognize in this crowd, given that I've been here all of 1 month. Austin definitely knows how to welcome new people to town. I also want to add that we're having a little bit of a little LeWittian love fest here on campus. In addition to the two landmarks works, we also have a wall drawing on view in the Alumni Collects show at the Blanton that's terrific, and I urge you to see it if you haven't. And next year in February, the first exhibition that I'll be curating at the Blanton is going to look at the work of Eva Hesse and Sol LeWitt and how their friendship informed each other's practices. So keep an eye out for that. There's more LeWitt love to come. Before I begin my lecture, I did want to just share a brief story about my own introduction to Sol LeWitt. I met him more than a decade ago when I first moved to New York and had graduated from college in my first job as a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And I was assigned the task of coordinating his traveling retrospective for the Whitney. And although that experience really shaped my life and my career in innumerable ways, there's one experience that really stands out among all of them that stayed with me over the years. And it was a call I got from Sol one afternoon, shortly before the retrospective opened. He said, Veronica, I need you to do something for me. I need you to make a list of every person at the museum who worked on this exhibition, including interns. And he said, it's very important. And Sol never pronounced things very important, so I was intrigued and set about correctly spelling and making sure to include every single person who had worked on the show. And the next thing I knew, Sol appeared. He came into the Whitney with an enormous box, and he sat down with me, and inside it was this woodcut, this print, and an edition of 65 for me and the other 64 staff members I had put on that list. And he then sat down and personally inscribed each and every one. But he left the museum after that. He didn't want to pass them out. And I had the pleasure of the next few days, which were two of the happiest days of my job, distributing these prints to the other staff members. And I mention this story because it speaks not only to Sol's remarkable generosity as a human being, but it also speaks to the collaborative nature of his practice, which was really integral to his work. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that tonight. Any exhibition you put on, as anyone in a museum and landmarks knows, it's always a collaborative effort, but with Sol, that's really more the case. For the LeWitt retrospective, I had to hire all of the drafters, the students, the artists who helped make the wall drawings. A team of masons had to be hired as well. But the subject of my lecture tonight is the concrete block structure that Landmarks acquired and that hopefully you passed on your as you walked in, and the ink wash wall drawing that is just nearby on long-term loan from the LeWitt estate. And tonight I'm hoping to contextualize these works for all of you within Sol's conceptual art practice, and to underscore the way that Sol really found freedom in systems and in limits. Excuse me, my jacket's making noise. I'll take this off. The way he found constraints to paradoxically be productive. And I think all of us can relate to this on a very basic level. I know that when I encounter a 6-page menu at a restaurant, I beeline for the hamburger. While we can all perhaps relate to limitations being freeing, I think this was really actually an integral part of Sol's working methods, as I hope to demonstrate tonight. And I'm going to be talking mostly about his three-dimensional work, but I wanted to use this example to kind of as a case in point. This is one of my favorite wall drawings, wall drawing number 51, and that Sol first made in 1970. He was invited to do a show in Torino, Italy, and expecting a normal rectangular expanse, he arrived and found this. The wall is a wonky hexagonal shape. It's not even flat. It has faceted edges at the top. The ceiling looks like two spaceships have crashed into the wall, and they're covered with these lovely, enormous vents. And then to add to insult to injury, there are outlets all throughout the bottom. And Sol took one look at this and decided to, instead of trying to minimize these eyesores, he accentuated them. And he came up with a wall drawing, which he called Wall Drawing 51, very matter-of-factly, all points connected by architectural snap lines. And those are lines that are made by snapping string covered in blue chalk in straight lines. But basically, the logic of the piece is to connect every corner of every object to every other corner of every object, and then to every corner of the wall itself. So what you wind up with is an amazing LeWittian labyrinth, a simple concept that yields a web of lines. And I just want to show you a few other examples at other institutions. This is at Mass MoCA right now. This is a beloved wall drawing that's traveled all over the world and seen various guises. And I remember at the Whitney, he called me one day and he said, Veronica, I need you to find the ugliest wall on the 4th floor. And I delightedly went looking for exit signs and outlets and found just the perfect wall for Wall Drawing 51. And I also remember a visitor comment card a few weeks after the show opened that was forwarded to me. It was written by an 11-year-old boy who pointed out that we were missing one line. And sure enough, he was right. And I think it underscores an important point. The system itself was incredibly simple, enough so that an 11-year-old could grasp it. In fact, he grasped it better than the drafters, or me. But somehow it quickly devolved into complexity. And there's this constant fluctuation between simplicity and complexity that I find really moving and interesting in Sol's practice. But I think more than anything, this wall drawing really points out about how being confronted by severe limitations can actually result in inspired thinking. At least it certainly did for Sol LeWitt. Before I talk about Sol's love of systems and limits, I want to explain why he called himself a conceptual artist, because that term is bandied around so loosely now. And I think it's critical to understanding his work and what made his practice radical and so influential. Nowadays, really, everyone calls themselves a conceptual artist. But what did that mean at this juncture in the 1960s when that term was just beginning to become part of common parlance? Sol did not invent the term conceptual art, but he's really one of the first to identify himself as a conceptual artist and to articulate what that means in a very famous essay, so famous, sorry, I don't have a good scan of it, but called Paragraphs on Conceptual Art that he published for Artforum in 1967. And in this essay, it's become so much a sort of manifesto for conceptual art and influenced thinking in so many ways that I hadn't checked out Wikipedia in a while, but I noticed that he gets top billing. When you look up conceptual art, the first artist who's mentioned is Sol LeWitt. And in fact, the definition that in Paragraphs on Conceptual Art is even cited. And I'm going to read it to you. Because it's so important. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, and feel free to come towards the front, anyone who's in the back, it's not going to disturb me at one bit. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctory affair. Some of the drafters here today may differ with the perfunctory affair part, but that's the concept. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And it's that last sentence that has really become, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. It's really, to me, the seed. So here you see it emblazoned on the shirts of staff members at Mass MoCA when his retrospective opened in North Adams, Massachusetts. I urge you all to see it, although you have until 2033 to do so, since it's going to be up for a while. And what I think Sol LeWitt really, what he really articulates in this essay that's so critical is really a radical rethinking of the idea of the work of art, It's privileging the work of art, the concept behind a work of art more so over the object that it results in. So really taking that emphasis and focusing on the idea or the concept. And part of that, and connected to that, is really redefining the role of the artist as well. Redefining the role of the artist to that of a thinker rather than of a craftsman. And I want to show you this is one of the works that I think best exemplifies what an idea-based art actually looks like. This is a work called Serial Project Number 1, ABCD, and it's owned by MoMA. Sorry for the lousy reproduction. But Sol's interest in ideas was inextricably connected to his interest in seriality, and which he defined as a multi-part composition with a system or a series of regulated changes. Basically something with a program. So he described it as working with a plan, was a way of avoiding subjectivity, avoiding the capricious or the arbitrary. The plan would design the work. And if you look at this work, one of his most complete serial works, you begin to understand its logic. And I'm sorry I don't have a pointer here, but can I move? Oh yes, I can move. I couldn't remember if I was tied here. So what you're looking at is basically, this is a grid and mentally divided into 4, and each quadrant, divide those into 9. And the quadrants are A, B, C, and D. And you're looking on the upper left is A, and the lower left is B, and then C, and then D. And the logic of the piece is open cubes inside, open and closed cubes, open cubes and closed cubes and squares inside other open and closed cubes and squares. And you start to understand the logic if you look in the left corner, quadrant A. What you're seeing is a closed form or a solid form inside. All of those are solid forms inside open. And then you're seeing open inside open. You're seeing closed inside closed, open inside closed. And you're also seeing that there's a logical progression. It's always going up 1 unit towards the center. And I think that's where he actually is making a choice here. He's making a choice, but I think it's so that you can understand the logic by putting the tallest forms towards the center of the composition. And how one of the things that really interests me about this work is that it's actually easier to understand visually than it is to describe verbally. And I mean, it's really a ludicrously simple idea of open and closed cubes. But the other thing that interests me about the work is that you complete it in your head and in your mind. According to the system, if you follow the logic, and let me see, I think I have a better image of it at MoMA here. Yeah, so if you look at this and you figure out the logic, see those 2 totally solid cubes? Well, you can imagine, what you understand looking at this is that the far left solid cube should have a white square inside of it. And then the one to the right of it should have a white cube, an open cube inside of it. But you don't actually see that. You just visually complete the piece in your head. And when I installed this piece at MoMA a couple years ago, I was really intrigued. I thought, do they actually have the square and the cube underneath? So I asked the preparators to bring everything out, and sure enough, both pieces, both the square and the cube, did exist. But the way Sol talks about the work is really interesting. He talks about the serial artist does not attempt to produce a beautiful or mysterious object, but functions merely as a clerk, cataloging the results of his premise. It's a very different notion of art making. And I can tell you that while this may not strike us as beautiful in an aesthetic way, I have personally observed people staring at this and looking at this for hours. So kudos to you, Sol. I wanted to mention that, and first of all, I thought it would be nice to actually see a little bit of what he looks like. But Sol credited much of his philosophy about art to an early job he held, an early day job, or in this case, a night job he had working at MoMA, back when it was called the Modern. He worked as a night watchman, his terms, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1960, well before he had become famous. And it was there that he met Robert Mangold, who became a lifelong friend, the painter Robert Mangold, Robert Ryman, who decided to become an artist instead of a jazz musician while he was working his day job at MoMA, and Dan Flavin. And Lucy Lepard, the future art critic, was a page in the library. I wish I had worked at MoMA at that time instead of in the 2000s. But anyway, Sol later characterized this period as I love the way he says this, as a big event in my life, and my art life too. Working there and seeing the art and talking to other artists had a lot to do with my development as an artist. And one of the things Sol talked about with this group of artists was a desire to reinvent art and to try out new ways of thinking, to start at square one, as he so aptly put it. And while he really admired the abstract expressionists, and he felt that the movement was moribund, that it had exhausted its best ideas, and he wasn't interested in the expressive nature of gestural painting. In fact, he seemed to be doing everything he could to reject it. He was interested in ideas. And to backtrack just a bit, Sol developed the idea of seriality that we just talked about with ABCD during his time at MoMA, and he credits a couple of people as being really influential in his thinking, and one of those people is Dan Flavin. In particular, this 1963 work called The Nominal Three to Willem of Ockham. And LeWitt and Flavin talked a lot about art at MoMA, or as Sol once put it, Flavin talked and he listened. I guess Flavin was kind of a talker. But in any case, this work was critical to Sol's thinking, and if you see it, it is very much a serial work. It's considered a classic minimal work, but it also has this notion of seriality, which is it's one fluorescent tube, and then it's two, and then it's three, and they're evenly spaced and spaced on the wall. And the other two people that he talks about as being really important in his search for this new way of thinking. One is Bach, who you had the pleasure, hopefully, of hearing on your way in. Bach and his musical compositions, even though Sol was very close friends with avant-garde composer Steve Reich, I can never say his name right, and also Philip Glass. It was really Bach who influenced his practice more than anyone. And the person that he credits the most often is perhaps a little unexpected. It's the 19th century British photographer Edward Muybridge, although lots of artists in this period were really interested in Muybridge. And he discovered a book left behind in an apartment in the 1950s in New York and flipped through it and was just completely captivated and obsessively started making works about Muybridge. And initially they were sort of these works that showed running figures and just kind of imitated the locomotion studies. But then it was really this idea, if you look at this locomotion study, you can really see envision the, this is Muybridge trying to figure out if a horse ever, in this famous bet, trying to figure out if a horse ever lifts all four legs off the ground when it's in full stride. And you've got your answer here on the top second image. But what he did is he set up banks of cameras at very precise mathematical and scientific intervals to capture the horse in motion. And I really think you can think of the line or the cube in Sol's practice as very much like the horse. It was a motif that he subjected to these sort of rigorous systems and sequences. In our journey looking at the cube, since that becomes, as I just said, a motif that he explores throughout his practice, I want to share with you, you'll hear Gary Garrels, who is the curator of the retrospective that I worked on. He is still at SF MoMA, or back at SF MoMA. You'll hear him introduce this, but this is a really important and pivotal work for Sol. So give me 1 second. There we go. Called Incomplete Open Cubes.
LeWitt is one of the key figures in minimal and conceptual art, which was an art that was involved with geometry, with ideas, with perception. The way that the mind and the eye and physical space interact.
Well, the idea part is simple, but the visual perception is complex. Same thing with some of the three-dimensional open cube pieces. If you make a drawing of each side, for instance, maybe a square, a grid, so that's orderly. But when it becomes three-dimensional, you look at it, it becomes chaos. And then you walk around it again, and you see it in different lines of sight. It becomes orderly again.
So in this piece, when you see it at first, it's almost indecipherable. It's a monumental piece. It fills this whole gallery, this whole room. But as you begin to look at it, you parse it out. You untangle the puzzle. And you begin to engage your own intellectual processes of problem solving.
I had been using open cubes. This was actually a way of not making a cube. All the ways of the cube not being complete. So that was the basic idea. Working it out was another process.
The art comes from very...
Stop there. Let Sol have the last word. All right, give me one second. Here we go. Voila. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this work and the commentary is also Sol's not just working serially within a composition, but one idea is generating the next, and he's working, as you saw in that video, he made a gridded work that's owned by SF MoMA with all of these aluminum incomplete open cubes, and he laid them out on a grid with going from 3 sides. That's the minimum number of sides you need to have an incomplete cube, because 2 sides is really just a square. So you need that third dimension. And then he lays it out on a grid and up to the 11-sided or 11-barred cube, because of course 12 would be complete. So it's the 3 to 11. And he's laid it out super logically on this grid, but it becomes this amazing, complex thing. But and he thought this idea sounded so simple. I mean, it's variations of incomplete open cubes. You can express this in a few words. But when he actually went to figure out how many combinations there were, he didn't have access to a computer, and he found it very challenging. So funny that we're talking about this in this room. But so here you see his drawings, and look how many he's crossed out. It's because what he figured out is, oh no, if I rotate that in space, it's really just the mirrored image of another one. It's a duplicate. And then he started bending paper clips. I mean, can you imagine the hours that he must have spent trying to figure this out? And finally, he came up with as much, here it is, here they are laid out. Finally, he came up with the number of 122, which I'm sure most of you in this room could have arrived at much more easily and simply. And he asked a physicist and mathematician at Columbia to please verify his results, and also had a math grad student he was friends with double check as well. And but again, as I said, this work was serial on many levels. He explored it on the grid with these small aluminum sculptures. He made he made this diagram that was also in the Sol LeWitt retrospective. He showed you the diagram, and he showed you every combination. You could figure it out on the walls. He made photographs. He made, here are large incomplete open cubes that were recently installed in New York by the Public Art Fund in downtown. So he really, he not only exhausted this idea in a single work, but across work. And in 2000, when he was asked what he would do if a new variation was ever found, he said, "That would be good news. I hear they're selling well." He had a great sense of humor. Speaking of the cube, so again, exploring one idea would often lead to the next. We're jumping ahead here to later work that Sol LeWitt did that feels quite different in spirit from some of those early structures that I was showing you. But although Sol made three-dimensional works long before he made wall drawings, you see him here exploring in this landmarks wall drawing, number 520. You see him exploring, continuing his explorations of the cube. And he does that in wall drawings, especially after 1980. And I attribute that to the fact that he moves to Italy in 1980. He lives in Italy, where he lives for 6 years. When asked about how it's different from New York, he says just better food. But he lives in Italy for 6 years, and he got married to his wife, Carol, who was Italian descent. So I really think both getting married late in his life and moving to Italy kind of opened up his practice. And I make that point because the early work is pencil wall drawing, colored pencil wall drawing. All of a sudden, you see this explosion of color. And all of a sudden, you see lines suddenly yielding to a wide variety of geometric shapes, tetrahedrons, pyramids, stars. Just the work really opens. But you also see that he's loosening up a little bit, that there's not a system in place for this wall drawing. It's not as rigorous and systematic and serial as the earlier structures that I was showing you. These are just cubes that are floating on the wall. They're not some, there's not a finite or set number or orientation to them. And but what I think he is doing is he's still using a very restrictive and elemental vocabulary. And I think that you also see, I think his use of color is really important to understand. The way this work is made is just with red, yellow, blue, and gray. Printer's ink. It's how something is made in a newspaper, how different colors are achieved. It's not, there was no one applying orange to the wall. And I think that that is a critical part of his approach to color. He did use color in a very systematic and limited and restrained way. So I'm just going to show you, I'm sorry that this is a bad image. Oh, here you see it, but it's lush up close. You can actually see the texture of the wall and how these, you can also see how his time in Italy, he's obviously responding to Italian fresco painting. Here's the diagram, and this is, Sol had it like his, I think he almost had his own language, his own like sort of cuneiform almost. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, which referred to the different directions of lines that he would put in diagrams for wall drawings. And then drafters would also have to interpret diagrams like this, where he would write RRBR, RRY, RBBBR. And all of that is really just the order of color as it's laid onto the plane of the cube or onto the wall. So red, red, blue, red. Red, red, yellow, red, red, gray. Again, not a rigorous system of or sequence, but it's this sort of language that he created, and I think of it as interesting as kind of like a generative code, almost like computer code, really, which is you all know many of you know far more about than I do, but it's really a sequence of zeros and ones. So it's this language that people were interpreting. And what's interesting to me about this is that from R, Y, B, and gray, you can just get such infinite variety. It was also in the 1980s, and here you're seeing the structure, the circle with towers outside without people. I do like the photos with people more, but here you're seeing it outside, and it's also, even though this was just done on campus, as Andre mentioned, it was first done a couple years ago at Madison Square Park, and really the idea for the concrete block structures came about during the 1980s, and of course that language of the cube is integral. And I think we see here the principle of restraint pushed even further. The concrete blocks themselves come in set sizes. Sol didn't make any special sizes. He just used what was readily available. And there are few materials more humble than a concrete block. It's not a traditional sculptural material. It's really the stuff of elementary school gymnasiums and college dorm rooms. The arts writer Jean-Claire Van Ryzen recently called this a minimalist Stonehenge, which I thought was really great. Let me just show you a few other examples in here in its most prosaic form. You all know a concrete block. But let me show you a few examples of other concrete block structures that Sol's done over the years. And I think one of the things you'll notice as I scan through these is it's interesting to me how often they conjure ancient architectural forms. At the same moment that his wall drawings are responding to Italian fresco, you see him responding, I think, to the most ancient of architectural forms, the pyramid and the tower. Here's one in Bremen. Another one, and here we are back in, this is actually back in Madison Square Park. So I make this point that that he's responding, I think, not only to Europe, but he's also, I think, really that these concrete block structures really respond more to the world of architecture than they do sculpture. And I think Sol, that's the reason he calls them structures. He never ever referred to his work as sculpture. He always called them structures. Everything three-dimensional he made was a structure. And I think it was because he didn't feel connected to that history, the traditional history of sculpture, and he felt much more connected to architecture. And his connections with architecture are really interesting. early in his career, before he even writes paragraphs on conceptual art, he writes this fascinating essay called Ziggurats. And in this essay, he writes about the building codes that were in effect in Manhattan that were passed in 1916 to prevent precisely this kind of building, the equitable building. In fact, this was the building that was controversial and that led to these building codes. And basically what was happening is all of a sudden you had all these skyscrapers coming up in Manhattan, and they were these huge concrete slabs, and they were taking all the light and the air on the streets below. And so zoning codes, or building codes, sorry, setback codes were passed that said that you had to set back the building at the top to allow more light and air onto the street. And Sol writes this essay, this short, pithy, wonderful little essay about how he thinks these zoning codes actually led to some of the best buildings in Manhattan. And when you think of the setbacks, you think of the Art Deco setback profile. You think of all those great skyscrapers from the 20s and 30s. And it's interesting, he said, by having to conform to this rather rigid code, aestheticism was avoided, but the code was flexible enough to allow great originality of design. But there are other connections to architecture as well. Before Sol worked at MoMA as a night watchman, he briefly worked in a very lowly job for the architect I.M. Pei, long before really either of them were terribly famous. My impression is that he was helping make signage for a New Jersey shopping mall, so this was not a very elevated position, but he talks about how that brief experience really shaped his thinking, and what he was interested in was the fact that an architect is a person who designs a building but doesn't actually construct it. And that underscored his idea that you could be an artist without actually physically making the work yourself. And he actually drew this analogy even more so with music. He described the wall drawings as like musical scores, and he was the composer who created the musical scores but for others to play. And I think this brings up the whole question, and it's integral to all of the both of the works in Landmarks collection, is the idea of having other people do your work. And I was so happy when I was working on the wall drawing catalog Raisonné to find this really hilarious review of a show, and this is the Omaha, Nebraska Herald, and this idea that he wouldn't make the work himself, that the lines weren't always drawn by him, and it's something that still makes people somewhat uncomfortable. And here you see a funny sort of derisive critique of LeWitt that anyone can make a masterpiece. You just have to come up with the idea, write the instructions, and get someone to execute it. But I think it's important to think about why Sol liked working with, why he liked working with assistants, and because that was actually part of it was important to his practice. I'm going to let him say a few words about this, and this is my last little interactive video.
At first, I was doing them all myself, but when they got larger and time became shorter, it was necessary to have help. And eventually, the help got to do them much better than I. And also, once you accept the idea of scale and the idea of size, that many of these things were done for shows with a limited time, it was inevitable that it would have to have a lot of help.
I'm not going to be able to go into great length about the nature of his collaborative practice. It's something I'm really interested in. But one of the things I did want to mention is that it's important to understand he actually did make a lot of the wall drawings early on. He did do many of them. It just, as he points out, for practical reasons, especially since he showed more in Europe than in the United States, he couldn't be in LA and Amsterdam at the same time drawing. So this freed him up to make more work. But it also was, he made the point that the work was not about his hand. In fact, he'd done everything to prevent people from associating the work with the quality of his own hand. It wasn't about his personal hand. That was important to him. And but it's interesting, some of the wall drawings from the 1970s, he really actually enjoys the collaborative nature, and he leaves decisions to be made by the drafters. And there's always a way that the drafters end up having a role in the wall drawings. I mean, no two wall drawings are ever the same. Even the same wall drawing when drawn twice, just like music, no two Bach compositions are ever going to be played the same way twice. So there's an interesting element there too. But one of the things that I respect about his collaborative practice is the way he always openly acknowledged the contribution of others. And it confounds museums sometimes that, you know, it leads to, this is a, let me just show you. Sorry, I think I'm still on the video here. Okay, here we go. Here we go. That here you see the label at MoMA for one of their wall drawings, and everything looks kind of normal until you get to the part drawn by Rob Nelson, Anthony Sensata. He insisted that the drafter's role be acknowledged, and this was true from very early on in his practice. And so unlike many other artists, I mean, there have been artists have been working with assistants and collaboratively for centuries, since Rubens, since before then. But it's rare that labor is being acknowledged so clearly. And I think that, you know, if you look at like a Damien Hirst dot painting, you're not going to know who actually painted it. But finally, I want to conclude, because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I want to conclude with talking about the way that this conceptual art practice has been enormously influential, and also sort of return to this idea of limits being freeing and being liberating. Because I think that if there are artists in the room, there are some of you this point may really resonate. And if we think about the 1960s and minimal and conceptual art that both emerged around that time, they both have been enormously influential and significant to contemporary artistic practice. But I would argue, and those terms are sometimes loosely used. I mean, there are very few minimal artists who liked ever, you know, subscribe to that term. But if we think of minimalism and its repercussions, very often, and its reverberations, very often the artists of today who are looking at minimal practice are invoking and imitating its forms, its industrial materials. And I would argue that that conceptual art has been so much more influential in the long run, because what people are looking at when they look at Sol LeWitt, what artists are looking at when they look at Sol LeWitt and early conceptual artists, they're not imitating the form. They're looking at the idea of the artist, the idea of the practice, the idea that the idea is the most important thing, and also this idea that you could create a system and a set of rules to follow. And so I want to give an example, and some of you had the privilege of hearing her. I want to give the example of, I think we can all agree this does not look very much like a Sol LeWitt work of art, but some of you had the privilege of hearing Nina Kachadorian speak earlier this week to an art class on campus. And she's just one of, I could have picked any number of people, but I picked her because she considers herself a conceptual artist that, like Sol, she's a Brooklyn-based artist. She's in her, I think, early 40s. And like Sol, she doesn't think of herself as a medium-specific artist. She thinks of herself as an artist who uses whatever means make most sense for the idea. But more importantly, she loves rules and limitations. And she even made this point in her lecture, how she finds restrictions and limiting herself to be freeing. And I think this body of work called Seat Assignment exemplifies that best. This is a body of work that she made, and she has made entirely on airplanes using her iPhone. And it's a body of work that she travels an enormous amount. She's got family all over the world, and she's constantly being asked to give lectures. And she was getting frustrated by the fact that she was spending so much time on planes and not productively and not able to be in the studio. So she thought, okay, well, why don't I make the plane my studio? So basically, the tray table, is her studio. And if you can think, I think that's putting the notion of limits and restraint to like an all-new level, because there's very few things that feel as restrictive as an airplane seat, especially these days. So she does not pepper her this project with any props. She only brings what she would bring on any flight, a black blanket basically, maybe a magazine, and she works with the in-flight magazines and whatever comes down the aisle, essentially. So here you're seeing Pretzel Meteor, one of my favorites. And it's interesting, she noticed that she was making a lot of disaster landscapes on the plane, so it's probably connected to that sense of anxiety. This is sweater lint that she's using above a volcano or above a mountain. And, because of course the in-flight magazines are trying to make you not feel constricted and not feel restrained and thinking about the amazing destination you're about to arrive at. I just love these. And here, but it's interesting. So she has this incredibly restrictive space, but she kept coming up. This has been an ongoing series. She's actually, I think her flight to Austin this week was her 94th flight. And she's still making this work because she has not exhausted the possibilities. Here these are called high altitude spirit photography, this body of work. She is using the glare of the light above the seat, and she's angling the magazine page so that these people basically look like they're having some moment of religious revelation. And of course, they're really just at Club Med. And then here's an image where she realized that if she held up a magazine against the window, she was sitting in the window seat at one point, and she held up a magazine, and she realized you could see the reverse side would come through. And this is a beautiful one because you're seeing this old building and then this modern city coming through. It's really lovely. But I think what she's become best known for, and it's kind of went viral, was she pushed it a little further. One flight, she went into the lavatory restroom, and she was just playing with the toilet seat cover, and she put it around her. This is the first photo she took. She put it over her head, and she's like, "Gosh, it kind of looked like a painting." And she decided maybe she should explore this a little further. And she was invited to do an exhibition in New Zealand, and she decided that she would actually create the entire exhibition on the plane ride to New Zealand. And so she knew that she had that 18-hour leg between San Francisco and Auckland. I mean, talk about pressure pressure to make something. And this is what resulted. No, 18-hour flight, most people are snoozing, so people always ask if she gets bothered when she's in the lavatory restroom, but she says that on all of 94 flights, she's been asked questions 3 times and very rarely interrupted. So here she is using toilet paper, using the black shawl. She's still using her iPhone. She's taking this picture in a moving airplane with her hand extended, and the black shawl is just on behind her that she carries because she hates the airplane blanket. I think we can all relate to that. Here's the inflatable seat, and here are a few others. This is, I think, less Flemish, maybe a little more Spanish, but I use this work because I think it points to me, this is some of the most interesting work she's made, and it's actually quite interesting. It's not just, it's funny. She's one of the few artists I know who really embraces humor and isn't afraid of it, but there's also something profound about it for me, and this notion, I think it's interesting that she's using the iPhone to take all of this, and when you think about planes, they're accelerating our lives, they're allowing us to be in more places, they're helping us get our jobs done. The iPhone, we can be connected to people at all times, we can be so productive, but of course these things actually end up constantly trapping us. We feel trapped by our technology, and constantly on the go, this notion of mobile devices and the mobility of planes, they're supposed to be helping us, but sometimes they take away, I think, our ability to think and be productive. So I think there's something quite remarkable about the way she's using things that are often we are distracted by, and using them in such imaginative ways and creative ways. And I want to just conclude with this quote from a professor and journalist, Martha Bale, that I think applies to both Nina and to Sol LeWitt. Without freedom, order is oppression. Without order, freedom is chaos. And I will end on that lovely chaotic note.